In the mid-1600s, the wild, untamed land of Florida became the unlikely stage for a deadly clash between two European powers, France and Spain. But this wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a battle for faith, with Protestant French Huguenots and Catholic Spanish soldiers locked in a struggle that would shape the region's future. In 1564, a group of French settlers arrived on Florida's northeastern coast. They were Huguenots, Protestants fleeing religious persecution in France, seeking freedom and new opportunities in the New World. Led by René Goulain de Laudonnière, they established Fort Caroline on a bluff overlooking the wide, meandering River of May, now known as the St. John's River. For these settlers, Florida promised a fresh start. Fort Caroline became their refuge, a sanctuary where they could live and worship free from Catholic oppression. But life on this frontier was harsh. Supplies ran low, relations with local Timucua tribes wavered between cooperation and tension, and internal disagreements simmered. Still, the French held on, fortified by their faith and a vision of a thriving colony. Unbeknownst to them, their arrival had not gone unnoticed. Spain, which had claimed Florida for its empire decades earlier, saw the French settlement as an affront. Not only were these Frenchmen trespassers, but they were Protestants, heretics in the eyes of Catholic Spain. Word of Fort Caroline construction reached King Philip II in Madrid. He immediately dispatched a seasoned commander, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, with orders to secure Florida for the Spanish crown and eradicate the French presence. In September 1565, he landed farther down the coast and established St. Augustine, a settlement destined to become the oldest continuously inhabited European city in the United States. For Menéndez, St. Augustine was more than a colony. It was a fortress, a foothold to drive out the French and proclaim Spanish dominance over Florida once and for all. The settlers received reinforcements from France, including Jean Ribaut, a rival to Laudonnière, who took command of the colony. Eager to take the offensive against the Spanish, Ribaut gathered his fleet and sailed south intent on striking Menéndez at St. Augustine. But fate intervened. Ribaut's ships had sailed directly into a hurricane that decimated his fleet, leaving his forces wrecked and stranded along Florida's northeast coast. Menéndez seized the opportunity. With Ribault's fleet and forces isolated, Menéndez led a land assault on Fort Caroline. In the early hours of September 20th, 1565, Menéndez and his soldiers stormed the fort. The French garrison was caught by surprise and vastly outnumbered. They quickly capitulated to the superior Spanish force. However, Menéndez's men would show no mercy as they proceeded to slaughter most of the settlers, including women and even children. Only a handful of survivors, including Laudonnière, managed to escape into the dense wilderness and eventually make the long voyage back to France. With Fort Caroline in Spanish hands, Menéndez's focus turned to Ribaut and his shipwrecked men. Reports soon came that the French survivors had gathered near an inlet south of St. Augustine. Menéndez marched to meet them, offering terms of surrender. Exhausted, starving, and with no hope of rescue, the French accepted. But Menéndez had no intention of showing clemency. Once the French laid down their arms, he ordered their execution. The inlet where the massacre occurred became known as Matanzas, Spanish for slaughters. Only a few were spared. Those who professed Catholic faith or possessed skills deemed useful to the Spanish. After the fall of Fort Caroline and the massacre at Matanzas Inlet, news of the brutality spread across Europe. For most, it was yet another chapter in the violent rivalry between Spain and France. But for Dominique de Gourgues, a French nobleman and privateer, it was personal. Though not a Huguenot himself, de Gourgues was deeply angered by Spain's actions, particularly the execution of his fellow countrymen. The event sparked a desire for revenge that would drive him back to Florida in one of history's more unusual acts of vengeance. In 1567, de Gourgues secretly outfitted a small fleet with his own funds and sailed to the New World. His official mission was ostensibly one of exploration, but de Gourgues had a very specific goal: revenge, His fleet included several hundred men, a mix of soldiers and sailors, and he relied heavily on surprise to achieve his plan. Arriving in Florida in 1568, de Gourgues allied with the local Timucua people, who harbored their own grievances against the Spanish. Together, the French and Timucua launched a series of surprise attacks on the Spanish outposts that had been built on the ruins of Fort Caroline. In a swift and brutal campaign, de Gourgues and his forces overpowered the Spanish defenders. In an eerie mirror of what Menéndez had done to the French, de Gourgues captured dozens of Spanish soldiers and executed them, hanging their bodies from trees with a sign labeling them not as Spaniards but as traitors, robbers, and murderers. Shortly after, he and his men returned to Europe, leaving Florida once again under Spanish control. De Gourgues' actions were celebrated by some in France as an act of justice, but they also drew criticism for their brutality. Despite his success, de Gourgues faded into relative obscurity, living out his days in France. The clash between the French Huguenots and the Spanish in 16th century Florida was more than a battle for territory. It was a collision of faith and empire. The massacres at Fort Caroline and Matanzas Inlet marked the end of France's colonial ambitions in Florida and solidified Spain's dominance in the region. Today, the ruins of Fort Caroline and the tranquil Matanzas Inlet serve as haunting reminders of this brutal chapter, where hope and ambition met the harsh realities of empire